Today, we'll explore what it means to moderate a deliberative forum, which to us at the National Issues Forums Institute is not just facilitating a conversation, but helping people talk, decide, and act together for the public good. I'm very excited to talk with you all today. All right, Kenny, next slide. So the first session, this session is the first in our fall Talk, Decide, Act workshop series. We'll spend our time defining what makes a discussion deliberative, exploring moderator practices, and learning from each other's experiences. We'll begin with an overview of key concepts of moderating for deliberation, given by myself and the amazing Betty Knighton, followed by breakout groups for community-based organizations and one for education professionals and those in higher education. In the breakout sessions, skilled moderators will share their experiences moderating for deliberation and will facilitate a discussion among participants. We'll have space for discussing key questions and debriefing what you heard in the opening presentation during that breakout time. We encourage you to be active in the chat during our presentation, but want to give you a heads up that we plan to answer questions and facilitate discussion among participants during the breakout sessions. So make use of that chat, share ideas with one another, share resources, feel free to make that an active conversation as we move forward. The presentation portion of today's workshop will be recorded, and we will share the recording, copies of the slides, and resources mentioned during the workshop on Monday of next week. We're so grateful that you're here today, and we hope you'll make plans to join us as well on November 6th for our Decide workshop, which will focus on framing issues for deliberation, and our ACT workshop on December 4th that focuses on how do we move from talk to action and how do we utilize deliberation as a tool for decision making and action in our communities, on our campuses, or in whatever context we find ourselves in. All right, I want to tell you a little bit about National Issues Forums Institute before we get into the meat of our discussion. At NIFI, we believe public problems cannot be solved without public participation. For over 40 years, we've worked to equip, empower, and mobilize people to use deliberation to take action for the public good. Our work is guided by three commitments. We want to equip community members, citizens, communities, and campuses and others with the tools and resources for public decision making. So oftentimes that is our nonpartisan discussion guides that you can find on our website. We also work to empower people with skills and confidence to engage in deliberation and to engage others in deliberation in their communities and on their campuses. And so this workshop is the first of many that we hope to have in the coming months and years that focus on that skill building work. We also are committed to mobilizing networks of practitioners and scholars to strengthen civic life in our democracy, particularly work around deliberative democracy. So when you hear the name National Issues Forums, what are National Issues Forums? Next slide, please, Kenny. Just a little bit more about them. The National Issues Forums or deliberative forums that use the NIF model are locally convened, nonpartisan, multi-perspective discussions on issues that affect our communities and the nation. They're generally led by volunteer moderators who help groups weigh choices, consider trade-offs, and identify shared directions for action. The National Issues Forums Institute produces nonpartisan discussion guides on national issues, but we also work with individuals and organizations to equip them to frame local and regional issues for deliberation. And on our website, you can find some examples of not only NIF framed issue guides, but issue guides that others within our network and across the country have developed that are useful tools for sparking deliberation. So what is deliberation and why do we do it? Deliberation is more than discussion. It's talking with one another and not at each other about what we should do together. The primary question at the heart of deliberation is what should we do? Not just what can we do, but what should we do? Deliberation centers focus on the problem at hand rather than on a party, platform, or personalities surrounding the issue. When we deliberate, we weigh approaches and possible solutions, explore tensions, examine trade-offs, and look for common ground for decision making and action. One helpful tool, like I just mentioned, for exploring possible solutions, tensions, and trade-offs are deliberative issue guides, like the ones available on our website. You do not need an issue guide to deliberate, but they are helpful tools. And as a sneak preview, that's what we'll be focusing on at our next workshop is how do you frame an issue for deliberation? Whether you're interested in creating a long, in-depth issue guide or just framing deliberative questions that help you work through an issue in the immediate future. Deliberation is a key civic skill, but is not a silver bullet solution. It's also not the only form of civil discourse necessary to a thriving civic life. We want to be clear about that from the beginning. When done well, we also need good debate that can help us choose among candidates, party platforms, and elevate better arguments for why we should be doing something. We also need dialogue, which helps us bridge divides and increase understanding. Not every public problem requires deliberation. So, when is deliberation most useful? Deliberation is most useful when people face complex, values based, or shared public issues, situations where there is no single right answer or technical solution, and where decisions require balancing competing priorities, interests, or moral considerations. So, for example, when deliberation is most useful when the problem is complex and affects many people. It helps groups unpack issues that are multifaceted and interdependent. Issues like housing affordability, education reform, community safety, where solutions require understanding how different concerns connect. Um, it also is useful when people disagree but must live with shared decisions. In divided communities, deliberation can provide a structured way to listen across differences and seek common ground. It can shift divisive conversations into more productive avenues for collective learning, trust building, and decision making. That's the goal, at least. Deliberation can also be useful when decision makers need public legitimacy or insight to make a decision. Elected officials, civic leaders, and institutions can use deliberation to gather informed public judgment, not just opinions about an issue. It helps ensure that decisions reflect what people value most, not only what they prefer in the moment. But there's an important caveat here. Deliberation should not be used just to inform the public about an issue that's already been decided. Asking the public to participate in deliberation and decision making when you really only want to inform them breeds distrust, exacerbates divides, and damages credibility. So that's a note of warning for when it's not useful. Deliberation can also be really useful when communities, with or without their government, are ready to move from talk to action. It's especially valuable before taking collective action, when communities must decide what to do next and how to do it together. It clarifies shared priorities and motivates collaboration. Deliberation can also be really useful when trust and civic capacity, need rebuilding. In moments of polarization or disengagement, deliberation can be a useful tool for restoring mutual trust, civic confidence, and problem solving, helping communities strengthen their civic muscles and the social fabric of a community. So, in summary, deliberation is most useful when the issue is important, the community is divided, and the path forward depends on mutual understanding, shared responsibility, and the opportunity to weigh potential solutions, costs, and consequences. So we wanted to give an introductory baseline on what deliberation is and when it can be useful. And now I'm really pleased to introduce my co-facilitator, the amazing Betty Knighton. Betty is the former executive director of the West Virginia Center for Civic Life, former president of the National Issues Forums Institute, and a longtime leader in the deliberative democracy field. Betty will now walk us through the core practices of moderating deliberative forums. Betty, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that introduction, Kristen, and so glad to be here with all of you. It's been so much fun to read what you're putting in the chat about the kind of work you're interested in doing or already doing in your communities and on your campuses, and we're really eager to hear more about that. In this portion of our workshop today, we want to give you some of the basic things that we've learned from the work that people around the country have been doing for many years in terms of what tends to promote a deliberative atmosphere on deliberative decision making in forums, whether they're in communities or on campuses or a combination of the both. The main thing I want to say, though, before we start this, is what you bring to this, and it will be the core basic work of your life in terms of many of you have had other experiences working in nonpartisan settings, working in partisan settings, working in on campuses and in communities in a whole range. Many of us have been teachers before. Whatever it is that brings this to you, those are the capacities and skills that you'll build on. What we're showing you today are some of the overarching things that we've learned about what makes for an effective deliberative discussion. But what you bring is your own personality, your own experiences, your own mindsets, and that's what's really invaluable. So you'll build on the core that you already have at this time. When you're moderating a deliberative forum, the basic goals are these. First of all, you're trying to examine different approaches for moving forward on an issue. If there was only one approach and everybody agreed to it, there probably wouldn't be any need for this. But that is not the way that public issues play out in our communities, and it's a good thing in a democracy. You're also trying to work through any tensions. By tensions, it doesn't necessarily mean a physical tension. It means how you're trying to look at ways to address the issue and what the trade-offs and consequences of going forward might be. And that creates a sense of we have to deal with this in some way that creates a mental tension, sometimes just in our own minds. So you're going to consider trade-offs of a wide range of potential actions. Some of those actions will just be initiated in the discussion that you are moderating. Sometimes it will be part of a framework that has been developed ahead of time. You're also there to reflect on what's been said. So in a deliberative forum, a lot of it is the deliberative experience of talking to each other, weighing and asking questions of one another. But then at the end, you really want to reflect back on, as a whole, what directions, if any, the group has set to move forward. And then you're also trying to identify whatever common ground exists for making any decisions that are going to lead to actions in your community. Now, the next slide will tell you about where these kinds and when these kinds of experiences can take place. And the brief answer is anywhere. There's no one setting, there's no one purpose, there's no one time for deliberative discussions to take place. Many of them are generated by people in communities that are interested in talking about an issue. A lot of deliberative forums take place in classrooms, in organizations on campuses. Sometimes the campus is the catalyst for the community to get involved. So it can be a very interactive experience. Sometimes it's within an individual organization that is trying to explore how they help others move forward on an issue. Many of them are in person. We learned a great deal about online discussions in 2020 when a lot of us were experiencing Zoom as a major way of connecting with people for the first time during the pandemic. And so we've had lots of experiences with all these different kinds of ways. They can take place in any place. I had a really good friend in another state who invited her neighbors. She had a big hot tub in her backyard, and they had a deliberative forum in the hot tub. Here in West Virginia, there was a rural community that really didn't have a place, so what they did is they all showed up at the volunteer fire department, and they pulled up their chairs right next to the fire trucks, and that's where they deliberated. So you don't have to have a specialized meeting room. You can have any place that people want to gather and where they feel comfortable gathering. And any kind of organization or individual can be the catalyst in setting the stage for a deliberative forum to take place in a community. Okay, the next slide. Um, you're playing multiple moderator roles, and I'm sure there's been many times in your life where you're juggling lots of things at once. So those juggling skills really will be useful to you when you're moderating because you're setting a tone with your welcoming attitude when people come in. You're listening closely. You are behaving neutrally. We'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. You're thinking about questions to ask, some of which you would have thought of ahead of time, and some of which you'll be thinking about on the spur of the moment as the conversation unfolds. You're going to encourage reflections and direction setting, and you're managing the time. And of all of those, what can be the most challenging is managing the time. Because when you have a group of people who have put aside whatever they were doing in their life to show up for a deliberative discussion, they probably have something to say. And the more people that you have in the room, the more people there will be that have something to say. And so you want to let everybody have the opportunity to say what they need to say, to ask the follow-up questions, but also to move ahead so that you can cover the breadth of the issue that you're working on within the allotted time that you have that night, knowing that not everything will get to be said by every person. So that's a pretty challenging part of this. I want to mention also that some moderators are very involved in organizing the deliberative discussion on their campus or in their community. They're involved in the outreach, they're involved in the invitations. That's another role, like the role of conveners. A lot of moderators stay involved and they help people in the community who want to act together based on the discussions to do that. So in this webinar, we're really focusing specifically on when you're in the room actually having the discussion. Now, the next two workshops that Kristen mentioned, the one on deciding and on acting, we'll get more into the role of the convener, both before forums take place and after they take place. So hopefully you'll come back with us for those two to kind of build that big picture look. Okay, next slide. Okay, behaving neutrally. I think one of the questions that we are asked the most often, and this NIF has been around for over 40 years, and a lot of us have been very involved for many of those years. People want to act, well, they'll say, I can't really be a moderator because I have a strong opinion about this issue. I know I have felt that way, especially when I first began doing this work, because you think, how can you be a part of a discussion where every different point of view needs to be explored and people need to express different perspectives than your own? And so we don't really say you don't have to be neutral because hardly any of us are neutral about almost any issue. But you can behave neutrally, sort of for the good of the group. You're setting aside your own personal opinion and the ability to express it in that moment so that others in your community or on your campus have a chance to do that. And so, in order to behave neutrally, it's not as hard as it sounds, even if you have strongly held positions. You just basically avoid disagreement or agreement with participants. And so you're not saying, oh, I agree with you, or that makes sense to me, so that people in the room have a kind of develop, you want them to develop a sense of trust that you're not trying to guide the conversation in any one particular direction based on your own point of view. I remember one time we were doing some practice here in a workshop, and one of the observations people made was that the moderator who was practicing was nodding when some people spoke and not nodding when other people spoke, which wasn't any word that was said. It was just, it gave people the sense that there was an agreement and maybe a favoritism for one particular point of view. So it's body language as well as what you say. Um,
Mm.
this next bullet is about avoiding your personal experiences to make a point for the same reason. Now, if your personal experience is not weighted in one way or another, depending on a point of view about an issue, I think it's fine to bring it in. But you don't want to share a personal experience that reveals how strongly you feel about one approach and how negatively you might feel about another approach to an issue. You certainly want to encourage discussion of different points of view. And then it's really important to know that even if you've done a really good job, or the conveners have done a really good job of getting a really diverse cross section of the community or the campus in the room, all different points of view aren't going to be represented. And sometimes you'll have a lot of people that kind of feel one way and hardly anybody that's looking at other points of view in their own personal lives. And so you might have to ask questions like, what else have you heard about this issue in your community? What do you hear from other people who disagree with you? So not every point of view will necessarily be represented by a person that's in the room, but at least you can ask other people to bring in what they've heard in their own lives. And surely that will widen the scope of the conversation. Okay, the next.
Betty, I want to add in a quick illustration of the behaving neutrally, or a
Uh-huh.
metaphor that's been helpful for us. So, some previous colleagues at the David Matthews Center for Civic Life in Alabama would refer to it as putting on the cloak of neutrality. So, if we have anybody who's a Harry Potter fan, and the cloak of invisibility theory, and so that helped us visualize before we were going into a forum or deliberative discussion. Okay, I'm not neutral about this issue, but for the sake of the group and the sake of the deliberation, I'm going to put on that cloak of neutrality. So I always got a good chuckle out of that example.
And I'll remember that one for sure. Yeah. Now, I will say this chart looks all neat and tidy, and this is the way you do it. And it is not that at all. It's just I didn't know how to make it look messy. But it is messy because it's messy in the most productive and human way when you're in a discussion. There's an ebb and a flow. There's a kind of a tide in a discussion. Sometimes you get recursive and you go back and revisit something. Sometimes you take a leap forward. So when I look at this with that caveat that it looks a lot neater and tidier here than it actually is, but it's the differences and the flexibility that really bring the beauty to the discussion. The first thing, of course, you're going to welcome participants, but you really want them to kind of feel connected to the issue as well. A lot of discussions that moderators have found very important to have a set of suggested guidelines. Now, these aren't hard and fast rules. This isn't a you must do this, you cannot do that. And we'll show you a set of some of these here briefly. But it's an idea that we're going to maintain a tone of respect, that we're going to listen to each other, that we're going to participate by listening as well as by talking. Those kinds of things. Very, very basic, but they're really helpful to get out in front of the discussion. When you're asking people to connect to the issue, it's like, what brought you here tonight or this afternoon? What is it about this issue that you connect to? Why do you care about it? Why do you think others care? But then the biggest chunk of what you're going to be doing in a deliberative forum is deliberating about the approaches. Now, it looks like it's the same amount of time as the other three on the screen, but that's not what it really is. It's really the major part of what you're trying to talk about. And that is looking at different approaches to addressing an issue. And you take any issue for an example, if it has to do with high quality education. Different people have different points of view about what that means and what it would take to get to the point where they want it to be. That the same would be true about housing or substance abuse or pretty much any issue. There are going to be multiple approaches. So that's really where you spend the bulk of your time. But it's really important to conclude a discussion with reflection so that you're not continuing to raise new points necessarily and to go back to the deliberative part of it. You're really trying to reflect on what have we learned together? What areas of common ground have we experienced? What are the areas of greatest difference? That'll be really useful for people to leave with that kind of understanding. And especially if people are planning to go on do some work together, that's going to be a really necessary part of the experience. Also, this graph really shows the stages of a deliberative forum, but I should have said forums, because in many situations, you're not going to meet just one time. You may find that you need two or three or more discussions in order to work through the complexities of an issue, especially if people are planning to work together on that issue. So this would be played out over three or four or five experiences as opposed to just one in many situations. Okay, next slide. These are some of the sample guidelines I mentioned. Considering different perspectives, do that in a fair way. Everyone is encouraged to participate, and as a moderator, your challenge will be finding ways to bring people in who may seem a little reluctant, but do it in a way that's very respectful in what they want to do themselves. The listening part, you want to have a respectful atmosphere. And then consider actions that might be taken in communities as well as nationally. A lot of issues are reported greatly at the national level, but you're also looking at what might happen in your own community. So that's another part of the guidelines. You can also come up with others of your own. You can ask people who show up for the discussion to weigh in on what they think would be effective guidelines to maintain these kinds of qualities in a discussion. Okay, next. Moderator moves. These are pretty basic, but I really like the thinking of them this way because different circumstances will call for different kinds of next steps. So somebody makes a comment, you ask a follow-up question to make sure it's more clear or to dig a little deeper. That's a really basic one. A reaction question would be something like somebody's made a comment, and so you say, what does someone else in the room, how would someone else in the room respond to that idea? That does two things. One, it deepens the deliberation, and also it makes connections between people in the room. And that's what you're really trying to do. You don't have to be, everything doesn't have to be filtered through you. So you are trying to get other people in the room to talk to each other, not just to you and back to them and you and back to them. So that's helpful in that way. Sometimes you know because the flow of the conversation is such, or because the clock on the wall tells you that it's time to move on to another perspective to look at. And so you have to ask a transition question. And this is why I said time management is one of the harder parts of this work, because you might realize that people have more to say. And yet, in order to be fair and to look at different perspectives within the time frame that you have, you might have to move on before it's quite ready. So you might say, well, I know there's more to say about this, but in the interest of time, we need to move on. That's just a pretty blunt way to do it. Or you could say, keeping that in mind, how might that appeal to those of you who favor this approach? So you could be a little bit more smooth about creating a transition that moves you on. And then sometimes it's important to summarize the key points, especially if the conversation has many different points being raised. It may be useful for you to do that in real time, but I certainly wouldn't feel like you have to do that all the time. But if the need arises, you might just be taking some notes briefly, in your lap to say, well, here's some of the main things I heard. What else have you heard to say that our key points were these for this discussion? Okay, next one. These are, and as Kristen said, these slides will be sent to you later, but we did put on here some of the slides, some of the questions that we have used ourselves probably many times that seem to be pretty good in almost every situation. So if you said to someone, how would this issue affect your life? That's a pretty probing question that most people could respond to. Most people have a thought about that. How would it affect the lives of others? And right there, you're getting into a deliberative mindset because your life versus the lives of others may be affected quite differently by a certain approach. So you're getting people to weigh out what that would feel like and how that would affect others. one of my favorite questions is there a downside of what you just said? And sometimes it's really helpful to ask that of the person who made the comment so that they're internally weighing what they have said. Would you give up? What would you give up to achieve this thing? So, would you give this up to achieve that? And then asking someone to illustrate a point. All these questions really help people, even though it's not quite obvious to them at the moment that they're deliberating. Answering these questions is a very deliberative act. Okay, another one. Next slide. All of these questions help you go deeper, and they're not questions that aren't very basic, ones that people can respond to. What strengths do we have to build on? How might this affect other people? One of the most important things to do in a forum, especially if people are considering moving on to acting together in some way, is the prioritizing questions. Like, if you can't do everything at once, where would be the most important place to start? And that's a deliberative question because they haven't a way. Well, we could do these 6 things, but what we really think is needed the most right now are these two. And so that can be a very important action to do as well. And then I think one of the questions I like to ask and what I think people respond to is, given what you care about, what are you most eager to see happen? So that connects the discussion to what might follow the discussion. And many people find that very gratifying to know that the discussion can lead on to something else. I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen now to get into the idea of, did I skip one? Go on to the next one for a second, Kenny. Oh, no, go back. Okay, we're in the right spot. I wanted to make sure we're kind of changing here, changing back to Kristen for a physical demonstration of how this part of the forum is different than the other part. And so we thought, well, if we switch right now from me back to her, you'll see that there is a divide between the deliberative part and the reflecting part, even though it's all taking place in the same forum in many cases. Okay, so back to Kristen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Betty. That was wonderful. And there, to be clear, the reflection part of the forum, you have a concentrated reflection time towards the end, but reflective moments can also happen throughout the deliberation, where as a moderator, you're helping tease out from participants, what new insights did you gain? Has your thinking changed? If so, how? Or has your thinking expanded around this issue, or how you view your perspective or someone else's perspective? Reflecting on what were the areas of greatest concern and what actions are most pressing. Like Betty said during the reflection time, you're helping the group prioritize and think about next steps. And to also realize that, in order to achieve the goals that they want, there might be some trade-offs. And so this is a time where the group really hones in on what they're willing and unwilling to accept as far as trade-offs about the issue. This is also the time in the deliberation where it's really important to start talking about what are our next steps and how do we ensure that they happen, so that this isn't just talk or just a conversation. Like Betty mentioned earlier, likely your deliberation, your conversation is the first of many. And so after your first deliberation, the next step might be, okay, when do we get together and talk again? And what are the key things we need to deliberate on next time? Or it might be setting steps for work groups that might come out of the deliberation based on the common ground or any consensus that emerges throughout the deliberation. And so we really wanted to highlight that this is the time that should not be skimped on. Oftentimes, folks get so into the deliberation and really get excited about working through the possible solutions and the approaches and options, that sometimes, as moderators, if we don't manage our time well enough, we don't allow enough time at the end for this reflecting. And so I generally encourage moderators to set aside at least 20 minutes at the end of a deliberation to focus on these types of reflective questions so that you're helping the group move towards common ground decision making and action together. All right, so now that you've had an overview of the key practices and types of questions moderators ask to prompt deliberation, and how they move folks through introducing the issue, connecting to their personal stake, really deliberating and working through options, and then also reflecting on the conversation, how do you know that what you're doing is working? How do you know it's going well? So you'll know a forum is going well when you see participants listening actively, asking each other questions, sharing experiences, and weighing trade offs fairly and fully. Some of the most delightful moments as a moderator is when you get to take a step back and see folks asking each other the deliberative questions, engaging with one another, bringing out trade-offs and weighing options as they're talking and engaging with one another. I remember frequently telling groups as I introduced myself and explained my role as a neutral moderator for the deliberative conversation, telling them it's okay if you forget my name, forget the organization's name at the end of this, as long as you remember each other's and the deliberation, the conversations that you had together. And so really emphasizing that can be important as well. It's about the conversation that the group has. Okay, so it's also a really good sign. Oh, sorry, one more thing before we get into the challenges, Kenny. It's also a really good sign if people are sharing their personal experiences as they're comfortable. You don't want to force those disclosures, but that shows that people are making the issue very real for them, for their community, their campus, whatever their context is. And it also helps make those reflection times more actionable and focused on concrete next steps. And so you know it's going really well if people have moved from the theoretical and often cerebral into the personal and concrete. All right, go ahead to the next slide. How many of you, when you think about the word forum or a town meeting or a public meeting of any sort, you think of maybe a Parks and Recreation episode where the town meeting is citizens yelling at each other and they're in a very adversarial stance with their local government? Oftentimes, that's what comes to mind. In the work that we do. And I love this scene from Parks and Rec where Leslie Knope says, "What I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring loudly with each other." And so oftentimes that's what comes to mind. Some of the challenges to anticipate as a moderator are, of course, moderating particularly heated or controversial issues. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Effectively soliciting participation from all, making sure that no one individual or group dominates the conversation. That can be very challenging, especially when you have power imbalances in the room. And so, for example, I've moderated many deliberations where you have a mixture of youth and adults in the room. And depending on the relationship between the youth and the adults, it might be teachers and students or parents and their kids, making time as a moderator and really using strategies to help bring out the voices of those who may not have as much power in the room is really important, and creating a space that is safe and welcoming for them to share their perspectives. So, for example, if you have a lot of young people in the room, I would tell them, let's say you're moderating a forum around an education related issue. I would tell the students in the room, you're experts on being students. Those of us who are adults in the room, we're no longer experts on being, middle schooler or high schooler, depending on their age group. And so asking for responses specifically from young people as they're comfortable to specific questions might be a strategy for addressing some of those. And then addressing extra talkative participants, we'll talk a little bit about that, managing time effectively, as Betty already mentioned, and being flexible while staying on track. Um, Moderating isn't always easy. You'll definitely face challenging moments. And so it is going to get messy occasionally. Let's dive deep with a few of the moderator challenges before we move into breakouts and talk with one another. And I'm sure dive deeper with a lot of these challenges. So, what are some strategies for handling dominating participants? Some key questions you can ask if someone is really dominating the conversation is, what do others think about this approach? What ideas have not yet been expressed? How would anyone else in the group respond to the concerns just expressed? And could someone else tell a story that illustrates that point? So you're validating the contribution that has been made by the dominating participant while clearly throwing the conversation in another direction. This is also a space to use body language. If you're in an in-person forum, oftentimes I will start stepping a little bit closer to the person who's dominating, keyed in on listening to them, but also then slowly shift my body when I ask a follow-up question to others, indicating that I'm looking for responses from elsewhere in the room, if possible. If someone is really, really dominating and they're will not stop, I wait for them to take a quick breath, jump in, summarize, and throw it back out to the group. This is often the most awkward part of moderating. I would say a dominating participant is the most common challenge when you're moderating for deliberation. But also, in an increasingly polarized environment, have occasional difficult participants. And some of the same strategies apply to them, especially the body language strategy. If you have someone who is getting really agitated and or expressing a level of vitriol or anger towards others in the group, you want to make sure that you're keeping a space that is safe for others. This is when having a great relationship with your convener or other folks who helped plan the deliberation in the room is helpful so that you can have someone else even come up and help step in as well if someone's getting truly out of hand. I've never had to have someone kicked out of a meeting, but it's not to say that that never ever happens. But having someone who can come in and be provide some assistance while you're moderating as well can be helpful. But a lot of times, simply referring to the guidelines, redirecting the conversation, also jumping in when they take a breath, summarizing and throwing it back out to the group can also be strategies for dealing with a difficult participant. I also do slowly use that body language and move closer to folks as well. One of the most common challenges we face these days is misinformation or disinformation from a participant. It The deliberation could really be taken off track if everyone if we're just taken down a rabbit hole of mis or disinformation. And so one of the most basic strategies that I use is asking someone to say, what meaning does that information have to you? Let's say someone's arguing about a statistic. What difference does that make? Or how do you see that playing out in your community or in your life? And so ask the person to make that statistic, that information real for their lives and apply it to their community. And then ask for, because oftentimes it's the feeling but behind that piece of mis or disinformation that is a stumbling block for a person or group within the deliberation. And then this is also a time to ask what other information is in the room and to use, if you have a discussion guide with reliable information, to pull out some of that information in the room as well. All right, two other moderator challenges that we will go through very quickly because we want to get to breakouts where you can ask questions of each other. These are some strategies for if all comments are directed to the moderator. We'll share these slides afterwards so you can dive deep with that, but I do want to emphasize very briefly when emotions run high, just to remind folks as they're preparing to be moderators, it's people first, not the issue or the agenda. And so making sure that we acknowledge when emotions are running high or when someone is deeply touched personally by an issue, and it's hard to keep that emotion inside. For example, I have lost family members to substance abuse, and when I've been in participating in forums related to the issue, it can be hard not to become emotional about that issue. And so making sure that we acknowledge what's happening, don't attempt to suppress or ignore the emotion, and if appropriate, ask the group to reflect, respond, and then continue the conversation. And at times, I've moderated a forum before where someone lost a child related to the issue that was at hand, and it was appropriate in that situation to take a brief break and process information, that story, and then coming back together once we knew everyone was okay before continuing the deliberation. So just a reminder that people always come first before the issue or the problem at hand. All right, next slide. Very, very briefly, I know many of you are familiar with Sam Kainer's groan zone. Deliberation is not rocket science, but it is messy and can be challenging. Every group that's truly deliberating reaches the groan zone when differences seem irreconcilable. Don't be afraid when your group reaches that groan zone. That's likely a sign that they're working through assumptions, familiar opinions, and encountering new ideas. So it's your role as a moderator to help participants work through that tension within the groan zone. That's where deep learning happens. If participants are really struggling with the groan zone, consider coming out, zooming out for a minute and asking, what tensions are we surfacing and hearing, and what makes solving this issue so challenging? This is the very first workshop in our new workshop series, but we're hoping to plan more deeper dives and opportunities that are useful to those in our network and beyond related to deliberation and specific topics and challenge areas within deliberation. over the next year or so. And so we'd be delighted if you'd take time to give us some feedback. There's a very short 4 question survey. None of the questions are required. So you can answer one question, all the questions, or anything. And so we just encourage you to use this QR code. We'll also drop the link in the chat and share it in the follow-up email on Monday. But we'd be delighted to have some of your opinions about what you'd like to see us focus on next, what sort of resources you'd like. The National Issues Forums Institute is in the process of compiling a new moderator handbook. And so we hope to release that later this year or early next year. And your feedback will be really important for helping us think through what are some of the sections that we need to adapt and grow and add to, especially as our context has changed significantly since I started doing this work in 2009. And so it's time for a lot of our resources to be updated in accordance with the environment that each of us are doing deliberative work in into. And so to access the QR code, you can take out your phone camera and scan that, and it will take you to a link to complete the survey. We will also drop the link for the survey in the chat, and it will be shared via email on Monday. I'd also love to encourage you, if you'd like to continue these conversations, to join us next month for Decide, an introduction to deliberative framing. During that conversation, we'll talk about what it looks like to create a deliberative discussion guide, whether it's a very formal one or something that's an informal list of deliberative questions to get folks deliberating together. And then we also invite you to join us on December 4th for our conversation about an introduction to deliberative talk to action initiatives. The link for that registration is not live yet, but that will be shared via email as well. I want to particularly thank Betty Knighton for her work. Thank you so much for all the content you provided, the wisdom and insight in preparing this session. We're really grateful. I want to thank Patty Deneen for, she's our Chief Administrative Officer at the National Issues Forums Institute. She holds us all together. And thank you, Patty, for running the show behind the scenes so that we all stay together. Kenny McGuan is also on. Thank you, Kenny, for running the slides, creating the links on the website, making sure the registration page is live, sending folks into breakout groups, and doing everything to make sure that this works in the technology that we have. And I also want to thank Dawn Harfman, who's joined us. She has been serving as an NCDD intern. With a placement here at the National Issues Forums Institute, and is now working with us as a program associate on some special projects, including one that will be announced soon. We're very excited to very soon debut a America's Next 250, What's Next America, a program for the semi-quincentennial, as an opportunity for folks to build on an opportunity or address a challenge in their community as a way to commemorate 250 years and build to the next 250. It was an absolute delight to see all of you today. Betty, am I missing anything before we sign off right on time?
I think that's everything. I'm so glad that you all were here with us, and we hope to see you again and stay in touch.
Absolutely. You can find us at nifi.org, and you can email me at cbronner@nifi.org. Thank you and have a wonderful day.